Welcome to part 2 of the Story of Melbourne, where we delve deeper into the city's fascinating early history. This segment draws inspiration from Edmund Finn's The Chronicles of Early Melbourne 1835 to 1851, penned under the pseudonym Gary Owen. We explore the meticulous planning and naming of Melbourne's streets and the formation of its first suburbs, uncovering the stories behind the city's foundation and its transformation into a thriving settlement. Join us as we continue to trace Melbourne's remarkable journey from its earliest days. The Yarra River, known to the Aboriginal people as Birrarung, held deep cultural significance. Early European settlers called it Yarra Yarra, a term in the Aboriginal language describing rapids or waterfalls. John Helder Wedge, a surveyor for the Batman Association, first recorded the name. Guided by two Aboriginal companions, he heard them call out Yarra Yarra while pointing to the river. Believing it was the river's name, Wedge adopted it. He later realized the term referred to a nearby waterfall and was also used for similar features, like those on the Werribee River. This misunderstanding gave Melbourne's iconic river the name we use today. In the early days of settlement, the decision to establish a capital city was far from straightforward. Three sites were considered: Melbourne, Williamstown, and Geelong. Each had its advantages and challenges. Melbourne had access to fresh water, but it was located miles away from the bay. Williamstown was ideally located near the bay, but lacked proximity to fresh water. Geelong boasted a beautiful harbour, but was hindered by a dangerous reef and its distance from the Barwon River, which was a source of fresh water. Geelong was undoubtedly a splendid site, but as history shows, Melbourne emerged as the winning choice, and perhaps rightly so. According to some early chroniclers, Melbourne's destiny nearly took a different turn. Just days after Governor Burke's arrival, a sharp earthquake reportedly struck, so alarming that the future of the settlement hung in the balance. The site was on the verge of being abandoned. However, after considerable hesitation, it was decided that the township would take its chance, and chance it did. The dramatic story of an earthquake threatening Melbourne's future doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Gary Owen refutes this tale and provides several examples to contradict it. The story claims that Governor Burke, shortly after arriving, felt a tremor and expressed concerns about the site's safety. However, Captain King, who accompanied Burke, recorded every detail of the 1837 visit in his meticulous diary, but made no mention of an earthquake. An event so extraordinary, it would surely have been noted. Similarly, surveyor Robert Hoddle's journal is silent on the matter, and Hoddle later stated he had no recollection of such an incident. Robert Russell, head of the Port Phillip survey staff, dismissed the earthquake story as fiction, though he confirmed that a minor tremor occurred later in March, after Burke had already departed. These examples suggest the timeline may have been distorted for dramatic effect. Another point of debate arose regarding the name of the new settlement. Public opinion in Van Diemen's Land favoured naming the town after Batman, while New South Wales influences preferred otherwise. The original Aboriginal name, Narrum, was considered too much of a consonantal challenge for European tongues. Another attempt, Bearbrass, attributed to Captain Stewart in what could only be called a momentary lapse of thought, was equally unappealing. There was even a proposal to call the settlement Glenelg, after the then Secretary of State for the Colonies. Ultimately, however, it was decided to name the town Melbourne, in honour of the nobleman who was serving as Britain's Prime Minister at the time. Thus, Melbourne it became, and Melbourne it remains. Meanwhile, the flatlands where Williamstown now stands were once so thickly covered with sheoak trees that the area was known as Kootbookbook, meaning clump of sheoak in the native language. This name was later replaced with its present title in honour of King William IV. As for Geelong, it retained its native designation, derived from the Aboriginal tribe that inhabited this picturesque locality. Sir Richard Burke played an active role in the planning and naming of Melbourne and its streets. The initial design consisted of a rectangular layout, covering a mile along the Yarra River and 3/4 of a mile in width. However, by 1840, this limited size had already drawn criticism. Newspaper writer Arden remarked that Burke, in allocating such a restricted area, had likely underestimated the extraordinary growth the settlement would soon experience. During Governor Burke's visit, a notable disagreement arose between him and surveyor Robert Hoddle regarding the width of Melbourne's streets. Burke proposed limiting street widths to 66 feet, with smaller lanes behind to provide secondary access. Hoddle, however, argued for wider streets of 99 feet, emphasizing their long-term benefits for the city's health and convenience. Hoddle later recounted that, despite the governor's initial directive to narrow the streets, he successfully persuaded Burke to retain the 99-foot width. In return, Hoddle agreed to the inclusion of narrower 33-foot lanes, which would later evolve into streets lined with valuable buildings. Hoddle later adjusted the design for North and East Melbourne, ensuring all streets were 66 feet wide. On that same visit in 1837, Sir Richard Burke personally delivered the list of street names to Hoddle, names that continue to define the heart of Melbourne to this day. Thanks to Robert Hoddle, Melbourne today boasts its grand, wide streets that are 3 times as wide as the smaller lanes, rather than merely twice their size. The streets stretching north to south, from the Yarra to Latrobe Street, were named after key figures: Captain Flinders, one of the earliest navigators of Port Phillip Bay; Colonel Collins, Commandant of the convict settlement of 1803; Governor Burke; and Captain Lonsdale, as previously mentioned. Meanwhile, the streets running west to east were named for Lord Spencer, better known as Lord Althorpe during Melbourne's administration, Governor King of New South Wales, William Street after King William IV, and Queen Street after his consort. Interestingly, had the latter been named Adelaide Street, the tribute might have been both more distinct and more meaningful. Queen Adelaide was the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and Queen of Hanover from the 26th of June, 1830 to the 20th of June, 1837, as the wife of King William IV. Elizabeth Street was named in tribute to Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen of English history, according to surveyor Robert Hoddle. While some sources suggest it may have been named by Sir Richard Burke in honour of one of his daughters. Swanston Street commemorates Captain Swanston, chairman of the Batman Association, while Russell Street serves as a memento of the once popular Earl Russell. Stephen Street was named to honour a permanent Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, James Stephen. Stephen Street was renamed Exhibition Street by Melbourne City Council on 5 December 1898. It was renamed to celebrate the 1880 International Exhibition and the 1888 Centennial Exhibition, both held at the Royal Exhibition Building during the boom time of Marvellous Melbourne. The change only applied to the portion of Stephen Street north of Collins Street. The remainder was called Collins Place and kept that name until it became part of Exhibition Street in 1963. The origin of Spring Street's name has long been a subject of curiosity. One theory suggests that the street, when first surveyed, passed through a scenic, grassy landscape with timbered hills, rising gracefully from the Yarra towards Carlton Gardens. The beauty and freshness of the surroundings likely inspired the governor or surveyor to name it after the goddess of spring, reflecting the season's charm in this new land. Remarkably, this poetic notion aligns with Mr. Hoddle's account. He recalled that, upon reaching the crown of Eastern Hill, Sir Richard Burke was enchanted by the sight of black and white wattle trees flourishing where the Parliament Houses and Treasury now stand. Inspired, the governor declared the street should be named Spring Street. Another theory suggests that Burke intended the name as a tribute to Thomas Spring Rice, later Lord Morneagle, a prominent British statesman and personal friend who had been a political patron of Burke. Initially, Melbourne streets were only opened between Spencer and Swanston streets. The remaining sections followed soon after. When Superintendent Charles La Trobe arrived in 1839, he named the northern boundary Latrobe Street as a personal tribute to himself. Market Street, which connects Flinders Street through Collins Street, was not part of the original plan. It was first proposed by Robert Russell and later adopted by the government. A few years later, additional streets were formed and named. Ferry, A. Beckett, and Jeffcott Streets honoured three of Melbourne's early judges, while Franklin Street commemorates the great Arctic explorer Sir John Franklin, who once served as governor of Van Diemen's Land. The area across the Yarra River, stretching from Punt Road to Fisherman's Bend, was once collectively known as South Melbourne. In those early days, it was considered of little importance, as much of it was a dense, scrubby jungle teeming with snakes. Some early engineers even claimed that large ships could never safely anchor at Sandridge, a prediction that the railway pier would later prove spectacularly wrong. Sandridge later came to be known as Port Melbourne. When Melbourne was officially incorporated by the New South Wales legislature in 1842, the town was divided into wards, named Latrobe, Burke, Lonsdale, and Gipps. The latter honoured Sir George Gipps, who succeeded Sir Richard Burke as Governor of New South Wales. Gipps was, in turn, succeeded by Sir Charles Fitzroy, after whom the then struggling suburb of Newtown, later modernised as Collingwood, was associated with Melbourne Corporation as Fitzroy Ward. Originally, North Melbourne was intended to fall under both Burke and Gipps wards. However, as the city expanded, the northern part was surveyed, subdivided, and auctioned off by the government. Soon, streets were developed, houses were built, and the district became so populated that there were calls for the creation of new wards. This led to the establishment of Smith Ward and Hotham Ward. After Melbourne was surveyed, its streets and lanes named and mapped, the next logical step was to auction the land. To ensure fairness and convenience for local settlers, Sir Richard Burke granted permission for the sales to be held in Melbourne rather than Sydney. This decision spared residents the significant costs and time involved in travelling for the auctions. The first land sale took place on June 1, 1837, followed by a second on November 1 of the same year. Robert Hoddle, the principal survey officer, acted as the government auctioneer. At the time, most men of means preferred to live on their country stations, focusing on increasing their lambs and calves rather than speculating on city land. A few exceptions, including Batman, Faulkner, Gardner, Rucker, and Hodgson, participated, but competition remained modest, keeping prices relatively low. Melbourne streets, as mentioned earlier, were generously wide, 99 feet across, and the land lots measured half an acre, minus about 4 perches set aside for a right-of-way at the back. Interestingly, buyers were required to agree to a unique condition. Within 2 years, they had to construct a substantial building worth at least £20 on their purchased land. At the first sale, lots were auctioned in both Melbourne and Williamstown, while the second sale included only Melbourne lots. The average price of Melbourne lots at the first land sale was £35. At the second land sale in November 1837, Melbourne lots averaged £42. John Pascoe Faulkner, ever the first in everything, purchased Lot 1, the southeastern corner of King and Flinders Streets, for £32. Batman secured the southwest corner of Collins and William Streets for £60. The success of Melbourne's early land sales convinced officials that even higher prices might be achieved if future auctions were held in Sydney. Financially, this decision proved correct. In February 1838, a land sale in Sydney offered town, suburban, and country lots in Melbourne, Williamstown, and Geelong. Subsequent sales followed at regular intervals, and as Sydney investors entered the market, prices rose significantly. The rapid rise in Melbourne land values is exemplified by the story of S.J. Paddy Brown of Heidelberg. In the 1830s, he purchased a corner lot at Queen and Collins Streets for £40, paying a £4 deposit. Regretting the purchase, he attempted to sell the receipt to friends the next day, but failed and forfeited the land. Initially vacant, the land was used by the Wesleyans in 1839 to build a chapel. By 1857, when the Wesleyan Church sold the property, its value had skyrocketed to £40,000, 1,000 times the original purchase price. Sandridge, now known as Port Melbourne, was a modest seaside borough in its early days, offering a stark contrast to its modern development. In 1838, H. Maclean advertised in the Melbourne Advertiser that he provided a ferry service between Williamstown and Sandridge. His advertisement read, "The undersigned begs to inform the public that he has a boat and 2 men in readiness for the purpose of crossing and recrossing passengers between Williamstown and the opposite beach. Parties from Melbourne are requested to raise a smoke, and the boat will be at their service as soon as practicable." Following Maclean's instructions, travellers on the Sandridge side would signal him by raising a smoke. This likely involved lighting fires with the abundant tea tree scrub in the area, though his vague directions left much to interpretation. The green scrub, reluctant to burn cleanly, often produced excessive smoke, or even small infernos, as travellers tried to ensure their signal was noticed. Maclean's ferry service was short-lived, as other watermen soon entered the scene. Until the gold rush of 1851, Sandridge remained a poor and underdeveloped area, with its main activity centered around a few hotels catering to sailors and boatmen. Occasionally, Melbournians would visit for a stroll along the beach, enjoying the fresh sea air, often accompanied by a nip of rum or brandy from the seaside taverns. Despite its slow progress, Sandridge offered a glimpse of the seaside charm that would later make Port Melbourne a vibrant and significant part of the city. The name Sandridge was aptly chosen by the provincial superintendent, Charles La Trobe, for the area was little more than a sandhole when first visited by Europeans. At one point, a barrel painted white was hoisted atop a tree trunk, serving as a rudimentary fingerpost to guide travellers back to Melbourne. The first civilized habitation on Sandridge Beach was a tent pitched by an enterprising settler named Wilbraham Frederick Evelyn Liardet. The tent was soon replaced by a tavern, which in turn was joined by another pub, and eventually by a scattering of houses. When Melbourne's corporate boundaries were enlarged, Sandridge was incorporated as one of its municipal appendages, though initially a troublesome and unprofitable one. The gold discoveries, however, provided the area with a much-needed push forward. What had been a languishing backwater sprang to life and began to develop into a thriving town. Sandridge, along with its surrounding district, is believed to have once formed a delta of the Yarra River. Travelling from Sandridge to Emerald Hill by this route was not a long walk, but it was certainly not a pleasant one, each step sinking the traveller ankle-deep in sand. Emerald Hill is today known as South Melbourne. The now fashionable seaside retreat of St Kilda had humbler beginnings. The Aborigines called it Uroroke, a name derived from the sandstone found in the area, which the Aboriginal people used to shape and sharpen their stone tomahawks. Its current name has a charming origin story. A memorable picnic once took place in a leafy, shaded corner of what would later be known as St Kilda. Among the distinguished guests was Charles La Trobe, the superintendent of Port Phillip. As champagne flowed and laughter echoed through the gathering, someone posed a question to La Trobe: "What shall we call this place?" At that moment, La Trobe's attention was drawn to the bay, where a small yacht sailed gracefully, resembling a swan gliding across the water. Inspired by the scene, he responded, "I don't think we can do better than name it after the captain's yacht." The yacht, called the St Kilda, lent its name to the suburb, which has carried it ever since. For several years, St Kilda remained little more than a picturesque seaside retreat, frequented by well-to-do Melbournians. On summer evenings, they flocked there to cool themselves after the day's heat and bustle. A comfortable hotel, managed by Mr. Howard, provided refreshments and rest, and half a dozen villa residences were built over time. Despite its charm, the land around St Kilda was largely sandy or overgrown with swamp scrub. In winter, travel between St Kilda and Brighton was often impossible, as the roads became impassable quagmires. Except on the Melbourne side, the area was surrounded by water and puddles, effectively isolating the suburb during the wetter months. By 1850, the growth of St Kilda received an unexpected boost. Cooperative land-buying societies had begun acquiring property in the area, but it was the golden age of the following year, the gold rush, that truly accelerated its development. St Kilda, along with its neighbours Windsor, Elsternwick, Caulfield, Malvern, and beyond, began to flourish. The suburb spread its wings, and its unspoken motto became a proud forward. At the time of naming its streets, the Crimean War had gripped the public imagination, even reaching the distant colony. The authorities, seemingly inspired, or war-bitten, bestowed upon St Kilda's roads a distinctly martial character. Streets were named to honour military heroes such as Wellington, Nelson, and Havelock, while others reflected the battlefields of the war: Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, Sebastopol, and Malakoff. A dash of law and equity found representation in Jarvis and Westbury streets, while statecraft was commemorated through Carlisle and Berkeley. The early colonists were not forgotten either, with names like Faulkner, Gurner, Greaves, Jackson, Dalgetty, and Burnett memorialised. Even literature made its mark, as illustrious names such as Byron, Scott, Southey, Dickens, Tennyson, Mitford, and Burns graced the streets of St Kilda. Windsor, the district nestled between St Kilda and Prahran, has always stood out for its seemingly incongruous name. Prahran, on the other hand, takes its name from an Aboriginal word meaning sandy, an apt descriptor for the area's original landscape. In its early days, Prahran was a little-known, sand-blown backwater, prone to slush and largely avoided, a stark contrast to its modern-day urban vibrancy. The early land transactions laid the groundwork for Richmond's transformation from bushland into one of Melbourne's most vibrant neighbourhoods. Richmond's subdivisions were originally planned as peaceful retreats for Melbourne's wealthy merchants and professionals to unwind with their families. However, within a few years, Richmond evolved into the vibrant, industrious hub it is today. While Carlton and Hotham preserved some charm, many Melbourne suburbs, including Richmond, fell victim to short-sighted land developers. These speculators prioritised profit over planning, cramming as many lots as possible into each parcel. Streets and lanes were hastily designed, often ending in cramped dead ends, with narrow yards and overcrowded terraces, a legacy of the gold rush frenzy. Richmond, unfortunately, has been permanently scarred by this approach. Every available corner where a house could be built was filled, leaving little room for open spaces or thoughtful planning. The original boundary of Old Melbourne was Spring Street, but it was clear the town would expand eastward. Surveyor Robert Hoddle planned to extend streets in that direction with new names, but Superintendent Latrobe vetoed the proposal, frustrating Hoddle. Latrobe's decision halted development, and years later, when the corporation revisited the idea, it was rejected again. The Fitzroy Gardens, now a jewel of East Melbourne, had humble beginnings. In 1839, the site was a bluestone quarry, providing material for the foundations of many prominent buildings. For years, it was more an eyesore than a thing of beauty. Its transformation into the splendid gardens we see today is largely credited to Clement Hodgkinson, a former Assistant Surveyor General. There was once a plan to build a crescent within the gardens, but it was ultimately rejected by the majority of the City Council. Instead, they chose to create a proper garden, a decision that has since defined the character of the area. Initially, little land in East Melbourne was sold when it was first offered, but public interest grew over time. In 1850, Bishop Perry secured a grant for Bishop's Court, where an elegant residence was soon built. Over the years, East Melbourne became a prestigious location for private residences, establishing its reputation as one of Melbourne's most desirable areas. Reflecting this exclusivity, its streets were named after distinguished figures, including princes, lords, and notable commoners: Albert, Clarendon, Gipps, Hotham, Grey, Powlett, and Simpson. The area's boundaries were equally distinguished: Queen Victoria to the north, the Duke of Wellington to the south, and the Marquess of Lansdowne and Robert Hoddle to the east and west. The inclusion of Mr. Robert Hoddle, Melbourne's first surveyor, came about in an unusual manner. Robert Hoddle recounted that Charles Latrobe once remarked on his modesty for not naming a street after himself. When Hoddle suggested the continuation of Collins Street, Latrobe agreed and noted it as Hoddle Street. Later, in jest, Latrobe proposed naming a street after the irritable Judge Willis, calling it A Cross Street. However, after a falling out with the judge, Latrobe erased his name and instead assigned Hoddle Street to the Cross Street. Hoddle's name was then removed from the continuation of Collins Street, which became Fitzroy Street in honour of Governor Sir Charles Fitzroy. In the end, Hoddle gained one of Melbourne's longest and widest streets, while Fitzroy Street became part of the Fitzroy Gardens. Fitzroy, originally known as Newtown and then Collingwood, became Melbourne's first suburb through public land sales in 1839. Land was sold in 25-acre parcels, mainly to Sydney investors, as the sale was held in Sydney, excluding most Melbourne residents. The area, intended for stately villas, instead developed into a mix of housing types. Over time, the suburb was renamed Fitzroy to honour Sir Charles Fitzroy, Governor of New South Wales, with its boundaries extending from Nicholson Street to Smith Street and Victoria Parade to Moore Street. The original crossing at the Yarra Falls in Melbourne was notoriously dangerous, with incidents like 26 cattle drowning. John Gardner discovered a safer crossing near Studley Park, enabling secure livestock movement. The area, once owned by John Dight, was later subdivided, reserving a central square for residents. The Yarra Falls also served as a gathering spot for Aboriginal people and later became a popular fishing site for early Melburnians, especially for herring. This poem, written in the 1830s, paints a striking picture of a time long past. Considering the contrast between then and now, one is reminded of the prophetic insight, if not the poetic flair, of an anonymous Collins Street poet. On February 14, 1839, this rhymer penned the following lines for an admiring public. Melbourne will rise in mighty state, and though a bantling now, will shame her parent and create a lustre round her brow. Melbourne left in her infant state, to flourish as she may, shall, notwithstanding this hard fate, behold a brighter day. Melbourne will flourish, raise the cup, loudly hurrah to her glory. Her day now dawns, her sun is up, and success will be her story. The mighty state and brighter day envisioned in the poet's verses have undoubtedly come true. Melbourne has grown into a vibrant, thriving metropolis. Yet, the identity of the poet who foresaw this transformation remains unknown, leaving their prophetic words as a lasting tribute to the city's incredible journey.